Chucky wanna play?
Look at me, Damien. It's all for you.
I am the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's work.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
They're here.
Welcome, everyone, to the third episode of the Gruesome Task podcast. My name is Deonte, and I'm here with my host,
Jose. It's nice to be here. Let's get this third week started.
Yes, and we got a very nice episode for you today. We'll mention what movie we are going to be talking about in a moment, but first we want to go ahead and give out our social medias and where you can find us, where you can find the podcast. The podcast Instagram is at Gruesome Task Podcast, and on Twitter at The Gruesome Task. You can find me on Instagram at xdeontems and on Twitter at _underthe-knife.
Yeah, you can find me at thatguyjose on Twitter, and you can find me on Instagram at j.a.gallegos.
Yes, and for the podcast, you can listen to it on pretty much any platform you can think of. We are on YouTube under the Apartment Complex brand. You can find us on Podbean, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. I do want to mention, I talked about in last episode, that if we got any reviews, we would go ahead and talk about them, and we do have one here. This one is coming from Who's Joe Daddy. Who's Joe Daddy says, "It really feels like I'm in the room with you guys and part of the conversation. You guys have a chemistry and matches, and it shows in how well y'all talk together about these films. You can hear the passion of these individuals, and I'm excited for more episodes to come."
Wow, thank you so much. That means a lot. I think that's probably our strongest thing we talked about when creating this podcast is that chemistry between us, and we definitely both have that passion for horror movies, and Deonte was the first guy I thought of when coming to him with this idea.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. You're so nice and kind. But yes, if you want to have your review read over the podcast, go ahead and drop. I don't know if you could do that through Spotify, but if you are listening in on Apple Podcasts, leave a rating, drop a review, and we will read it and give you a little bit of a shout out. So next up, what do you want to jump into, Jose?
Let's start off with the name of the movie. It's Blacula. That's what we're going to be talking about today, and it's this movie is definitely a good one. I'm excited to talk about. But in the meantime, I just want to make an important announcement that we have dropped this week. We have decided that any proceeds or donations that we get over this course of this Black and Horror series is definitely going to go back to the Black community. We aren't doing this for any type of profit. We're doing it out of the passion that we have for these horror movies, and we're excited to work with this series. This is definitely something we're passionate about. Aside from that horror aspect, Black and horror is definitely underrepresented, and we want to shed light on that and give you guys some more information, and definitely give you an opportunity to learn something new, especially about Black and horror.
Yes, and I'm glad that we were able to be able to talk about these movies with you all, bring some of these movies that you haven't heard to light, so that way you can check them out, check out the actors, and learn a little bit of the history behind them. So very well said, very well said. And like Jose mentioned, Blacula is the film we'll be talking about today. We can go ahead and jump in a little bit about the movie and a little bit about the actors. So if you wanted to get that started for me, sir.
Yes, Blacula came out in 1972 on August 5th. The director was William Crane. Our writers go to Joan Torres and Raymond Koenig. Our cast includes Blacula, or Mama Waldy, played by William Marshall. Tina, or Luva, is played by Vanetta McGee. Michelle is played by Denise Nicholas. Dr. Gordon Thomas was played by Thalmus Rasulala. and Lieutenant Jack Peters was played by Gordon Pinsent, and our Dracula in the movie is played by Charles Macaulay. The budget for this movie was $500,000, and the box office came in at $2,180,000. So that's a definite smash in the theaters. Our runtime of the movie comes in at 93 minutes. And one thing I wanted to stress about this movie is this is the first movie we reviewed that actually won an award. It was the first film to win the best horror film at the Saturn Awards through the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films. So that's kind of a hint at how good this movie is.
Yes, and while being, of course, a very well movie, very controversial at the time, I was quite surprised that it did win an award for it coming out in 1972 and being as what people would come to know as a blaxploitation film. So it's great stuff. And, we reviewed Night of the Living Dead and Candyman earlier, and the fact that those didn't win any of those type of awards is pretty shocking when you think about it.
Yeah, I definitely have to go back and do the research because I had never even heard of the Saturn Awards to begin with. So I wonder what else, what other horror movies followed by Blacula has won, and if it's still going on today.
Yes, that would be good to look into because I'm curious as well. Just like you, I had not heard of the Saturn Awards. I did want to go ahead while we are here. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anywhere that Blacula is streaming on any type of streaming services at all. So it's going to be a little bit of a difficult one to grab. There are a couple physical copies that you can look towards. The cheapest one is actually going to be a import copy. So like we talked about a little bit last week, when it comes to those PAL region Blu-rays and region-free Blu-ray players, you can get the complete collection that includes Blacula as well as its sequel, Scream, Blacula Scream, for pretty much about $20 shipped on Amazon. However, the US version of Blacula is again a collection featuring Scream, Blacula Scream. It was put out through Shout Factory, Scream Factory, their horror section, I should say. However, that is out of print. It was released in 2015 for $24.99. It has been long out of print, and the prices have skyrocketed up to $82.90 is what you're looking at paying right now, shipped to your door from Amazon. So I apologize.
I mean, you can always rent it and such because $80 for a movie is kind of a reach, especially for one that's not so popular.
You're not paying $80 for Like Mike on 4K?
No, man, only Criterion. It's got to be collector's edition.
Okay, so we talked about where you can watch it, where you can buy it. What do you want to jump into next before we get right into the nitty gritty, sir?
Yeah, I want to touch on that blaxploitation that you mentioned earlier. This movie was during that blaxploitation cinema. Basically, what that is, it's a part of exploitation cinema, which is really made up of independent produced movies like low budget B movies or grindhouse films. So these are like the real B movies of the horror genre, and they revolved around violent or taboo, and specifically made to attract audience through sensation and controversy. So that's very interesting, that this movie was made during that time, and it's something that I wasn't aware of as far as blaxploitation. I didn't know that was a certain genre in cinema. So it's definitely eye-opening to be able to realize that I'm watching a movie that came out during that time.
Yes, exactly. And like you mentioned regarding the shock and kind of awe factor that it was trying to attract, there's a lot of things in this film that definitely does, so, especially now with how I guess some of those kind of topics are a little inappropriate. Some of the phrases that they use that were very common in this film due to the time. And so, no surprise there that all that was included when this film was released.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, considering the time period that it came out in the 70s, it's definitely um, different to what we're used to now.
Mhm. Yes, and then it was. Now, the good thing is that since this film did well, that led to other blaxploitation films to be released, and just the few black horror films that we have gotten, and something like, for let's say, Candyman wouldn't have really been possible without this, and this probably wouldn't have been possible without Night of the Living Dead, which was released 4 years earlier.
Oh, for sure, definitely. I mean, this specific movie expanded into the sequel to Blacula, which was what was it? Scream, Blacula Scream.
Yes.
Yeah, so it led to that, and then eventually led to Blackenstein, which was another blaxploitation horror film based off of these original monsters that people have loved for so many years. Sorry.
And so, with that, before we go ahead and jump into the main film, did you want to add anything else to the blaxploitation films at all? I did have a couple things I just wanted to mention regarding the actors and actresses.
Yeah, I mean, blaxploitation, if I can definitely expand on that a bit. It was definitely a controversial time for Black people in the 70s period, because Junius Griffin, who was the head of the NAACP during that time, was completely against it. They fought against that. They thought these movies were portraying Black people as characters and, not real Black people, and they were just making these movies to get in that money to put Black people on a screen instead of something that's more realistic. And there was a lot of controversy during this time because you had certain things and different areas on the spectrum of how Black people believe they should be portrayed in movies. And these certain movies were the first movies that gave Black people the opportunities to be in films, be lead actors. They had only been like sidekicks and such before this time period. So just two different ways to look at it. You can look at it as Black people being put into this great spotlight. I mean, they definitely made some good money, a good profit, $2 million. But then there's the opposite side where they didn't believe it was the right way to go about things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, while not necessarily to that extent, we do see sometimes in modern day movies that we watch where Black people are portrayed very stereotypically. And that's, of course, what basically every single one of these blaxploitation films was at the end of the day. And it was done that way, from my understanding, because they wanted to attract the Black audience, but it ultimately ended up attracting, white people and not just people of all races for that matter. And I know as well that these were really the first type of movies to include soul and funk music.
Yeah, definitely. That sense of their culture was definitely put into more of a spotlight as well. Into these movies, you get long scenes of club activity, of how Black people would go and party at night. So it was definitely a change of scenery when you move away from the white typical movie. There's the white leads, white everything, and it definitely, in my opinion, put Black people in a bigger spotlight.
Mm-hmm. Right. So yeah, it's one of those things where it had its negatives, but at the end of the day, it turned, I guess, more of a positive because it led to more opportunities for these Black actors going forward. As I was, just looking through, a lot of these actors from these films had a longer career. This film in particular, Blacula, was more towards the beginning, and they were in tons of movies and or television roles afterwards.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when you consider the times, this one came out in 72, and Night of the Living Dead, which we've reviewed previously, came out in 68. So that's not very far away. And then that's when I guess you could say Night of the Living Dead gave a pathway for these blaxploitation films to be made and give black actors lead roles and becoming more.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. And regarding any type of like fun facts and things about the film and anything that may kind of attach that would be kind of factual or interesting about black exploitation, I know we mentioned last week we're going to start saving that till after the film, so we'll get to that there. I know that there was a couple, I think I had read something up about the NAACP being very critical of blaxploitation films, and even going into some of the films that we got later on, that we got a lot of those black movies in the 90s and early 2000s that focused heavily on the crime and the lifestyle that was happening in a lot of those urban areas. And it's kind of where they were critical of it during this time in the 70s. Now, 20 years, 25 years later, there wasn't that much changed in their eyes in the NAACP, even though all those movies did really well when you think about like Boys in the Hood and all that stuff, which is kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
We'll go ahead now. Let's jump right into it. Let's talk about Blacula.
You shall be Blacula, vampire, like myself, a living fiend.
Let's do it. So the movie starts off, you meet this Prince Mamuwaldu, and he's walking in with his wife Luva, and they meet Count Dracula, and they sit down for a dinner, and Mamuwaldu is conversing with Dracula about the slave trade. So this movie really brought that into a light, and they wanted to add that into the movie because it was the first to do so. It was the first to get black audiences to kind of focus on that slave trade, and Mamuwaldu is pleading with Dracula, saying that it's not right and that he needs to put an end to it, but Dracula says otherwise.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I know that Count Dracula essentially says that he believes that slavery has merit, and he then offers that he wants to actually buy Blacula's wife. Well, before he was Blacula, Prince Mamuwaldi, he wants to buy his wife, which just shows really how upfront he is about it, and that he wasn't afraid to hide, his kind of racism.
Yeah, and when he offers, I guess, to buy Luva, the wife, and Mamuwaldu is definitely insulted. He says Dracula is acting like an animal, and then Dracula comes back right at him. He's like, well, isn't that where you're originated from? And not Dracula, Mamuwaldu is definitely insulted at this point, and he's ready to leave, but Dracula prevents that, saying he's not going anywhere, and we get these guards come in and they start fighting Mamuwaldu.
Yes, and that's where we get the very first fight scene, which is where you get that 70s kind of cheesiness. But it's fun to watch though. And another kind of interesting thing that I wanted to go before we missed it. One of the other things that Count Dracula says is he says, "I desire for one of your color," which just kind of shows that like he doesn't even really view. It's kind of like they're just objects, It's like he could just buy him whenever he wants. It's not, this is a real human being. And that was just, it's disgusting, but that's how it was, because they're viewing it as this is back in time. So I think they show in the beginning clip that this was in the 1800s. Is that correct? 1886, I think?
No, 1780.
1780, okay. So yeah, of course, back then slavery was such a prominent thing. But yes, you're right. When they try to leave, the guards come and the fight ensues. And our man Mamuwaldi, he ends up getting knocked over. His head gets a huge gash, and then that's when they take his wife away from him, and the other guards that are there.
Yeah, at this point, Dracula he's left the room and he's come back with this army of vampires, and they entrap Luva, his wife, and then Mamuwaldo gets smashed over the head and he gets that gash, and Dracula goes over and he bites Mamuwaldo, and he says horrible stuff, and he says that he's always going to be enslaved and he's going to have to live a life of starvation, and it makes you really hate Dracula as a character outside of this movie as well, because I mean, obviously this Dracula is white and he's talking about wanting these slaves and treating black people as objects that he can buy, like Deonte mentioned earlier. It makes you hate Dracula.
Yes, and he then, as he has him placed down in the casket, Count Dracula starts putting the curse on Mamuwalde, who's the Black Prince, and he ends up saying, you shall be Blacula, and he tells the wife that she needs to listen for his cries, and he will come for you until your death, which is interesting, all enough. And then that's kind of where the scene ends for this flashback, and then we move forward to what is modern day.
Yeah, and before that we get this title sequence, and that's where that blaxploitation part comes in, because it's not typical horror music. It's more of that funk, that 70s type disco music.
Yes, that ends up coming in. Great music, though, by the way. It's a nice change of pace.
Yeah, definitely. It's something different, and the soundtrack would definitely be something I'm willing to get my hands on.
Mm-hmm. And that's where we end up going. We're introduced to Bobby and Billy. They are two men who are together, and they are interior designers, and they're pretty much buying Count Dracula's castle.
Yeah, they're with this estate salesman, and they're not necessarily buying the castle. They're buying the items within it to be able to sell them off for a profit. Yeah, they're getting all that. They're in, I guess, Transylvania. There you go. They flew over there. They're looking at the castle, and this is where the estate salesman says, "Oh, this was Dracula's castle." And Billy and Bobby are kind of brushing it off. They're like, Dracula's not real. I mean, nobody believes that. We've seen him in all the horror films. Like, they reference the previous Dracula films. So it's, and as far as them being together, you get that sense of them being a gay couple, but they don't really say it yet. So it's, you get that sense, and then they go throughout the castle looking at the different stuff.
Right. And yeah, and you get like the couple is mentioned a few times later in the film, and it's again one of those things where it talks about, I guess, how the times were in 1970 and how gay people were viewed back then, and so some of the vocabulary is a bit rough to listen to, but we'll definitely get to that later. One of the things that was kind of interesting is they go into that room where there's that casket there, and he tells the man who's selling them all the stuff, and he's saying, what does he mention? He says, like, this is included, right? Like, we want this, and the guy basically is just like, okay, like, you can have it. He wasn't really basically trying to put up a fight for it.
Yeah, and earlier when they were talking about prices for the stuff, Bobby was mentioned, or when he reacted to it being Dracula's castle, he was like, oh, so you're gonna knock off something because you didn't mention that, knock off some money because you didn't mention that earlier. And the estate salesman was like, yeah, take it, go ahead. Like, he was so willing to give everything up.
Yeah, it's like he knew what it was about to be, so he said, you could have it, just whatever. Just get it out of my hair.
Yeah, and take it to the other.
And we find out they probably shouldn't have bought all that stuff.
Oh, for sure. And yeah, it cuts to the next scene where they're transporting all these goods, all these furniture and such through boat. and they finally reach Los Angeles, and you get this very long scenes, very 70s movie type scenes where they I guess show you everything, that whole process, and you get the truck drive into the warehouse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a ton of stuff, and they go in that warehouse that they're in, and they're kind of going through some of the stuff, and then that's when we see the casket, and Billy ends up telling Bobby, he says, "Oh, wouldn't this be funny if we put this in the guest bedroom? You know, we have that bed or that couch up there." And so he tells him he tells him to open it up. So he gives him kind of like a crowbar, and he starts hitting it to open it up. And right when he hits it and the lock breaks, he takes off the lock, but he doesn't open up the casket because Billy cuts himself as he's trying to open up something else. And so, of course, Bobby goes to treat Billy, and that's where finally we get some action.
Yeah, so Bobby is treating Billy, and Billy's over there being dramatic, like, "I cut my arm, oh my gosh," and Bobby's telling me, relax, and you get these these different screen shots going back and forth from Blacula opening his casket all slowly, giving you that eerie feel, that sense of, oh, something bad is about to happen right now. And then it'll cut to Bobby and Billy, and they're still overreacting about their situation. And then Blacula comes, and he gets closer, and Bobby's sees him, and he's struck with fear, and he just stands still, and Billy hasn't turned around yet. And then you get the first killing where Blacula grabs Billy's cut arm, and he sucks the blood out of him, and he throws off Bobby to the side when he tries to save Billy, and Bobby's thrown into these cardboard boxes. One thing I did notice during this part, you don't get very many stunt scenes or stunt men in these older films. Like, these actors were doing their own stuff, so Bobby's over dramatic when he flies off, when he's thrown off.
Yes, that is true. And I know we mentioned that a little bit back in Night of the Living Dead, when I believe it was Barbara was she had done her own stunts as well. And yeah, it was Barbara. She had mentioned that she did all her own stunts for the film. And it's the same thing here. I think I only spotted really one spot where you could tell it was like a stunt person or either like a dummy that was in place for it. The funny, I did have a note here. The funny thing was too, is like when he threw Bobby, and then he went and he ended up going and biting Bobby and sucking his blood. Man, he sucked that boy up like a plucker's sweet tea, man. he cleaned him up good. I'm not gonna lie to you. Yeah. But we end up we then see where my man Blacula, he ends up walking off, and he grabs the cape that's laying there, and he puts it on. His drip was looking all clean, and then he ends up hearing the words like Blacula, and it clicks with them, and it's the same words that Count Dracula had told him before he closed the casket. And so that's where he finally realizes this character, this persona that he is now.
Yeah, that's the exact notes that I had here. He's embracing that Blacula part of him, that this is who he was made to be now, and now he's going to embody that and get his revenge. So then it goes and it cuts to Bobby in a coffin, and you see Mamuwaldu or Blacula looking through the curtains as Tina and Dr. Gordon Thomas and Michelle walk in with this funeral director, and he's showing them the body. And it's mentioned that Bobby was I believe it was a childhood friend of Michelle's, and they're paying their respects. And Tina and Michelle end up leaving, going to Bobby's family to pay their respects, and Dr. Gordon Thomas stays behind, and that's where he reveals that he's a scientific investigation. He's in that division.
Yeah, and then one of the things that we might want to mention is before all of them walk in, Bobby actually kind of like suddenly awakens. His hand raises, and then it plops down right before they walk in, and it plops down very weird on the casket. And when they walk in, Michelle actually asks, "Why is his hand like that?" And the gentleman working there says, "Oh, well, sometimes that kind of thing just happens. I'll touch him up." And so as the viewer, we of course know the story of Count Dracula, but we get the first sense that he's going to come back to life at some point in this movie.
Yeah, it gives you that foreshadowing of what could happen throughout the movie. And yeah, it was definitely a scary scene because you just see him and his hand moving, nothing else is moving. And then Tina comes in, she immediately notices it. And I guess in any other film, people would be clueless and not even notice those things.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And we also have Blacula who's behind a curtain, and he's looking at the scene going down, and he spots Tina, and Tina pulls back her kind of head wrap that she's wearing, and so you get to see her full face and her hair, and it clicks with Blacula. He is thinking this is his wife.
Yeah, this is where he gets that realization of maybe she's reincarnated, or she was turned into a vampire herself, that she's still alive. So he definitely recognizes her. I mean, it's the same actress, so you can tell that it's pretty obvious as well. But this is where his lust for her and his previous wife comes into play.
Right. And all of them walk out the room, and then it's just the doctor that's there, and he's kind of examining Billy. He's looking and notices what would you call the bites on the side of the neck. He starts feeling the skin and realizes that there's no veins. He's lost a great deal of blood, because got sucked like a Plucker sweet tea, so you don't got no blood left, man. And
yeah,
we get I apologize. What were you gonna say?
No, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say that the funeral director, they're claiming that it was a rat bite, and that's where the doctor starts getting his suspicions. Like, that's no rat bite. Rats don't do that.
Right. And the funeral director, he ends up coming back, but you don't know it's him because the way the angle the camera is, you just see this like large hand kind of placed on the doctor's shoulder. And so first time I watched the movie, I thought that it was Blacula. I thought he was about to get him already, but then he comes out and it's actually the funeral director. So I thought that was good. It was like a little mini jump scare.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting as well. I hadn't seen this movie before watching it for this, and I thought the same thing. I thought, wow, we're gonna get our second or however many killed now so quickly, and I guess this guy isn't very important, but it's the funeral director.
Yeah, and the doctor ends up asking the funeral director, he wants to see the other man, and this is where we get some of how times were back then with blacks and whites. And he ends up saying, well, he was a white one, I don't get many whites, as in saying he didn't even prepare him.
Yeah, that kind of gives you the feeling that Bobby and Billy were split up, because Bobby was a black gay man and Billy was a white gay man. So you got that, I forget the term for it, but that interracial relationship. And the funeral director himself, he calls that race into play, those race struggles, like, oh, the white man went to a different funeral home, he's not going to come to mine because I'm black.
Mm-hmm. Right. And again, this is one of the things I think the movie does really well, is that sentence of him saying, well, he was a white one, I didn't get many whites, hinting that he didn't prepare his body. That actually plays a role later on in the film. And it's just one of those little small things. And when we get to that point, and I'll mention it, this movie did a really good job of doing little small stuff like that. And then, which was really, really weird, is the doctor then leaves. And as soon as he leaves, the funeral director says, Huh. He was the rudest N-word I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, because the doctor was definitely very stern. He's asking him all these questions, not really caring about anything but the truth or the answers about what's going on. And the funeral director, he's like going into different stories and other things. And so that's when he says, oh, this is the rudest guy I've ever met.
Yeah, it's like the funeral director's probably never, I guess, been challenged about questions on how this person died, why they died, why is this that way. And he didn't like it coming from the doctor. He just wanted to kind of get through his job and be done with it. So that's, I don't know, I just found that funny, but also really, really weird that he would say that because the guy wasn't being rude.
No, he wasn't. He was just trying to get to the bottom of things. Another thing I did want to point out is that prejudice against the gay couple is that the doctor only refers to Billy and Bobby as associates. You don't get that acceptance of them being in a relationship.
That was a good catch. I didn't even notice that. Wow.
Yeah, definitely. And then from there you get Michelle and Tina walking down the street. And they reach the house that of Bobby's family. And Tina's like, no, I'm going to go home. I'm going to turn in. You can go ahead. I don't really feel good. And she bumps into Blacula, who's waiting there for her because earlier he had recognized her.
Yeah, and when they bump in to each other, he says, Luva, it's me. And she runs away. And as she runs, he has her purse, or she drops it. I don't remember, one of the two, but she had lost her purse. It had her ID and everything. And she's running, and Blacula is running after her. She's able to get away and get to her apartment, but Blacula ends up getting hit by a taxi.
Yeah, he gets run over, and this woman comes out, and she's like, what the hell? Like, are you okay? And he gets up like nothing, because obviously he's immortal. And she's like, oh, nothing's wrong with you. And then she starts blaming him for everything. Like, you gotta watch out where you're going. And one line that really stood out to me was, don't go chasing tail, it'll get you killed. So she saw him running after Tina. I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, and then the other thing as well that was very important is the terminology that the taxi cab driver used, and that's actually what set Blacula off to ultimately kill her. Blacula ends up starting it by saying, "I've lost her, you imbecile," and she says, "Imbecile, huh?" And she ends up calling him boy. And of course, we know that calling a black man or a black male boy is a term that, you know, slave owners and racist white people use for many, centuries, really. And so that triggered it in him because he's from back then. He's from the 1700s. And so as soon as that happens, you see his fangs pop out. He's got the hair that starts to grow on his face, and it triggered him. And he grabs her, bites her neck. Once again, like a delicate, delicious sweet tea from Pluckers, sucks on the blood.
Yeah, and then it cuts to Tina running. She's in her apartment building. One thing that I thought was funny with this part is because she doesn't have her key because she dropped her purse. They have this across the hallway. They have this locker type thing where I guess there's a bunch of keys in there. She grabs her apartment key from that and opens her door. I've never seen that in an apartment. I don't know if that was very popular back in the 70s, if it was before, I guess, crime rates had jumped, but I thought that was pretty interesting and telling of, I guess, the times back then.
Right, yeah, a little more trusting. And I think there was also a part where they mention that later on in the film, you find out that they live in the suburbs. And so that might have been something because they lived in a nicer neighborhood that was just normal.
Oh, yeah, that could be it. I missed that suburbs comment.
Yeah, and so we then get where Tina's in the apartment, And then she's there, and it was what's her name? It was Vanessa, or Michelle, excuse me. She comes, and she's like banging on the door, and Tina's there like ready to hit whoever comes in. Finds out it's Michelle, lets Michelle in, and then tells her of the story of what happened. Bumped into this man, he took my person ID. She was all worried. Scene then cuts to Blacula because he can't be out in the light. He's going back into his casket.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to touch on was when Tina was telling Michelle about the chase that she had gone through. She was very scared. It's definitely tough being alone at night, walking as a woman, and this touches on that very well because she felt like she was attacked. She felt like she was being followed. She thought she was going to get killed by this random guy on the street. And I guess Michelle, she doesn't necessarily brush it off, but she's like these bozos out in the street always causing some type of worry. And it points out to me that women shouldn't have to feel that way, but they do, and it's something that I wanted to touch on as well.
You're 100% correct. There's no reason at all why women should not be able to walk down the street at any time of day, daytime, nighttime, whenever, by themselves and worry. They should not have to worry, but unfortunately you have people who are crazy, that are weirdos, that are going to go out and do that kind of stuff. And movie was in 1972. That exact worry is happening now, if not even more. So
yeah, definitely. It's definitely something that needs to be addressed in today's times because women are being kidnapped. So that's really why I wanted to point that out, because it's been happening for centuries and that hasn't changed.
Right. Exactly. And after Blacula goes back to sleep, then the doctor ends up going to go to the morgue to go see Juanita Jones, the taxi driver. He ends up checking up on her the exact same way that he did Bobby. He looks for the bite marks and finds them. Once he sees those, he does the presses on the skin, realizes there's no veins, the veins are gone, and the blood has been basically completely sucked out. And that's when he starts to try and put two to two together that, hey, this just is not adding up.
Yeah, and that scene kind of ends with him saying that's ridiculous, and he's like, he doesn't want to believe that someone had bitten these people and sucked the life out of them, really. And he's saying that's ridiculous. He's playing it off. He doesn't believe it. He doesn't want to, but I mean, eventually he does. So it gives you that sense of him putting that two and two together.
Mm-hmm. And then from there, I know he goes to Lieutenant Jack's office, who I guess you could kind of say is like his boss, if you will. And this was something that was very interesting, is the doctor, he ends up bringing up the fact, he ends up asking him, because he wanted, he wanted the reports on Bobby and Billy, but they say that they couldn't find them. They were gone. They were missing. And the doctor brings up and says, oh, is this another one of those cyanide poisonings that you all put off as heart failure to kind of show like there's corruption in the police force? And then he says it's kind of strange how so many sloppy police jobs involve black victims. And immediately after, the lieutenant ends up bringing up, well, were those two people that were killed, were they Panthers? And for those who don't know, he's referencing to the Black Panther movement, which was very, very prominent around that time. The Black Panther movement started in 1966. It ended around 82, and it was a group for, Black pride, Black nationalism. They were anti-racism, anti-fascism, anti-imperialism, all that kind of stuff. And they had a lot of, I guess, bouts, if you will, with law enforcement. And that's why he brings that up. So you could kind of see where, because he was a lieutenant and he was, I wouldn't say he was necessarily racist, but he probably had some bad experiences with black people being Black Panthers at the time. And that's why he brings it up and asks. And you can see the doctor kind of like stick his nose up a little bit at it, of kind of like, well, what are you trying to say?
Yeah, and he doesn't necessarily ask if they were Panthers. He claims it was the Panthers. He asked the Dr. Gordon if it was the Panthers, and immediately Gordon replies, "Don't cop out." And that really touched me, because you still get that. You still get the law enforcement versus black people in today's times, and it bothers me that that's still going around. This movie was made in 1972 or 71 and came out in 72, and we're still getting that same problems, and it really points out to that, and it still holds up today.
Right. 100%. And so from there, what was the next scene after their little discussion? Because I remember that other cop came in, and he comes in and he kind of asks like, what are you guys doing? And he tells them to leave and to go on a scene, and he was just like still kind of there, and he was like, go. And it just made me think, well, does that other cop think that something's going on just because the black doctor's in there with him? You know what I mean? He seemed to question it.
Yeah, and it was Lieutenant Jack, and he orders him to go find the missing files on Bobby, and it gave me that sense of, by him questioning it, he's like, well, why do we need that? We buried that. We kind of hid that. And it made me feel like he knew exactly where they were, that there was no reason for them to be missing like Lieutenant Jack claims, and made me feel that hatred towards the police force, that them hiding and brushing away these black murders. So
right. Yeah, because it's kind of, I guess, from their mindset is like, well, these people aren't important, so we don't have to really do our jobs. We're just going to brush it under and move along.
Yeah, and then on top of that, the fact that they were a gay couple. Another thing, even Dr. Gordon had mentioned during this conversation, he refers to this gay couple as the F-word interiors. And it's that bad word you call the gay community, and it makes you, it doesn't sit right with me that was so popular as well. Is even all these types of people were against this gay community, and it's something that stood out for me, even though it was a different time and it was, I guess, more acceptable to say those kinds of things in movies. It stood out to me.
Yeah, luckily we've grown so much that kind of stuff isn't accepted. Obviously, there's still a lot of discrimination going towards the gay community, but compared to how it was in 1970, it's a lot more welcoming and open, which is great.
Yeah, and then from there we get this next scene where the funeral director is getting a call from Gordon to send in the body so he can get an autopsy done on Bobby. But the funeral director says that the family is coming the next day and that he can't authorize that. So we get Gordon telling him that his men are going to come over and check it out for Lieutenant Gordon. And then he mentions that he's going to be busy that night, that he can't go.
Right. And then the next scene we get, it does cut to the club. Like you had mentioned earlier before we started, these club scenes would usually be about 2 or 3 minutes long. And it's a group called the Hughes Corporation that is performing. Their most notable hit is Rock the Boat, which I'm sure everybody knows. Even if you don't know the Hughes Corporation, that song is everywhere in movies and commercials and whatnot. But they're performing, and we have the Doctor, Tina, and Michelle there, and they're all sitting down, and somehow, some way, Blacula finds his way to the club.
Yeah, and while this is going on, the Hughes Corporation is playing this long song, and one, I guess, lyric that I noticed was "There he is again," and that was them repeating that line while Blacula was coming into the club. So it was giving you that context. Oh, he's coming, and then he enters the club, and he asks the hostess working there if Tina was there, and he shows her the purse, and then the hostess goes and gets Tina, and Tina meets Blacula there at the entrance.
Yes, and when Tina then goes up to him, he gives her back the purse, and he mentions that they actually go back to the table, and he mentions that she bears a great resemblance to his wife, and that's why he had to follow her. So he starts to kind of give her the reasons and explanations for the reason they bumped into each other and he had chased her. And oddly enough, which is crazy to me because I feel like the story is wild, is that Tina is so accepting of it. And she's just kind of like, yeah, come sit with my sister and her man here. We're just enjoying the Hughes Corporation. Sit on down. It's not like you chase me or nothing.
Yeah. I wondered that too, is why she was so forgiving, and she just kind of accepted the fact, oh, I just looked like his wife, so he was chasing me down the street. I'm just gonna forget the fear that I was in last night. So
I know now I know maybe that's why I get chased all the time by people, because they think I look like Jason Momoa. Well, I should say Jason Momoa looks like me, but now it's totally understanding. I should have just watched Blacula years ago. But man, I lost my train of thought. But so they sit down, and maybe it's because Blacula, he comes across as just very, I don't want to say smooth, but in a way he kind of is smooth, and he's just kind of upfront, and the way he talks is very persuading, that Tina might have just been very impressionable, and so she just believed everything that Blacula said.
yeah, and as soon as he sits down, they mention that it's Michelle's birthday, and he orders a bottle of champagne, and Michelle's boyfriend, who's Dr. Gordon, he's like, well, why? What's the reason for that? And Michelle is like immediately like, stop, like, this guy. So they're very accepting of him. He's trying to win him over and be accepted.
Yeah, he's a very smart vampire.
Oh, for sure. He's very smooth, very smooth.
But then we get, so it's like a little bit later, and the doctor gets a call at the venue saying that the bodies are gone. And then he makes another phone call, and he comes back to the table and says that Bobby's body is gone, and he's like a little frantic. And so they're pretty much gonna leave in a moment, but he sits back down, and that's when we get introduced with the greatest character of the entire film.
Yeah, Skillet joins, and this guy is definitely a character. So it kind of refers back to that controversy of how black people were portrayed, because he was definitely a character. He was definitely out there cracking jokes, and he could just kind of invites himself to the table. He's like, he just sits down, and he's like, oh, is this champagne? And he pours himself a glass without even asking. So it and then pictures start getting taken of the table.
Yes, and the movies we pick are so wonderful, because last week we had Candyman in his clean ass dress pants, and Skillet came to party. He was wearing an orange dreamsicle color button down with the gray blazer, and then these bold glasses. I mean, dude was looking clean. He had the gap tooth to finish it off. I was jealous. Skillet, he's the best. Absolute best.
I think our mid-season episodes are just going to be Deonte dressing up in all these costumes that we find throughout these movies.
I'll tell you what, we're not going when the time comes where we start doing our actual video podcast as well, that'll be on YouTube, possibly starting maybe season 2.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll dress up all right. If there's a character that's dressed clean as a whistle, I'll dress up.
I'm looking forward to that.
You know, sometimes you got to stunt a little bit. but then we got, which is a little weird, when Skillet comes, Blacula goes to leave, and he's very kind of frantic about leaving, and we can assume it's because he needs to feast. He needs some blood. You know, the sun's going to be coming up soon, and so he goes to leave, and then as he's leaving, Skillet ends up saying, he was like, "That's a strange man," or strange dude. Apologize. He says strange dude, and the girl in purple, Tina, she goes after him, and she's like, "No, don't go. Like, where are you going?" And he kisses her hand, and this lady comes. It's a photographer, and she runs up, takes their picture really quickly, and it scares Blacula, and he runs off.
Yeah, he was at the point of smooth talking Tina, and he, like you said, he kisses her hand, and he just gets scared. I guess it's the flash of the camera that really, I guess, blinds him, gives him more. I don't know if it really reflects like that sunlight type of burning sensation, but he just runs off, and then you get to the next scene where the photographer comes back to the table, and she's like, "I'm gonna go get your pictures developed and run across the street." Her dark room is across the street, I guess, in her house, and this is where we get that 70s horror type film feeling where she's walking alone across the street. The music starts getting a little bit more darker, a little bit more scarier, and she's walking through her house. It's empty. She goes to the dark room. You get that red light on her, giving that demon type of setting, and Blacula walks through the door, but you don't see him necessarily walk. You just see the door open and his shadows are coming, and it gives you that suspense, and it builds that, and it kind of scared me, you know. Though I like that. I like that suspense. I like that eerie feeling, and it was definitely a good scene.
Yeah, that was a cool scene. I felt like this was the best Blacula kill that we've gotten so far because of the way that he jumps out, and he just looks really deranged, like really, really creepy. And his hands are up, and he's doing the whole like rah, and he just jumps at her, and ultimately ends up doing the same thing he's done always, bites her on the neck, sucks her blood, and that was it for our photographer.
Yeah, and as he's kind of like strangling her when he first grabs her, and that's where more of that terrifying feeling came from me, because he's got a good hold on her. He bites her, and then you see his hand go down from her neck to the picture of that she saw and that she developed of him and Tina, and he wasn't in that picture. It was just Tina, and she starts freaking out, and then that's when he attacks her, and he gets that picture and crumbles it just to destroy it, because he doesn't want people to know that he's a vampire.
Right, exactly. And then we get the next scene where the one of the officers, it was actually the officer from earlier that was sent out of the lieutenant's office, he pulls up to this house, and we have the photographer who's stumbling outside of the house. And I don't know if maybe this is it was like a racial thing, but the officer gets out of the car, like worried because of how she's stumbling and falls. But the first thing he says is this your house? It's like, well, why? In my head, I'm like, why wouldn't it be? She walked right out of the house, you know? I feel like it's very obvious that it's her house because her well, the officer doesn't know this, but I mean, why else would she be in the house in that type of clothing? You know.
I guess to me, I kind of saw it as him being that police officer. Like if she was in danger, and it wasn't her house, maybe he should get her out of there instead of trying to take her back into the house, which he ends up trying to do. So I guess that sense of, oh, I got to get her to safety. I don't know if this is her home. Should I get her back inside? Because she comes stumbling out like she's dying. So, but once he starts taking her in the house, that's when she turns into a vampire and she bites him as well.
Yeah, and I felt like she turned into a vampire pretty quickly compared to some of the others, like compared to at least from Billy, because it felt like the time frame between when Billy was bit to when he lifts his hand up in the casket was quite a while, and hers was like pretty immediate, which throughout the film continues. People that get bit pretty much immediately become vampires, but she bites him, so now he's gone as well. And then what was the next scene after that?
We get Jack at the police station with Gordon, and he asks Gordon if he had gotten the reports, and that's when Dr. Gordon says, no, I didn't get those reports last night. And that's where Jack starts to question, oh, what happened to that police officer I sent to get those reports? Like, something doesn't add up here. And then we get Dr. Gordon ask Jack if he can dig up Billy's grave. And this is the white man that was, he had already been buried while Bobby was missing from his casket and the funeral home. So Jack gives a lot of pushback saying, I can't do that. That's a lot to ask of me. And Dr. Gordon really kind of seduces him, and he's like, oh, come on, you can do this, just do it. And Jack eventually picks up the phone.
Right. And then one of the things that he mentions is when he talks about Billy's body missing, is I think it's Jack who says it. Maybe I'm wrong, but he says, who the hell wants a dead, and then like the F word.
Oh, I didn't catch that one. I caught the other one before. I didn't catch this one.
Yeah, I wrote down that quote because it's very like, it was another kind of thing where they're again degrading the gay culture and seeing as like these people are, I guess, outcasts in a way that they're not wanted or welcome. And it just goes to how people thought back then during that time frame. Yeah,
and you get a lot of tension throughout the different people in this movie. You got Dr. Gordon calling out the police force. You get both Dr. Gordon and Jack calling out the gay couple. So it's a lot of back and forth. And at this point, we get Gordon sitting in Michelle's office. And this is where we learn that she's a lab assistant in the same building and they work together. And that kind of stood out to me, that that sense of putting Black people in these, I guess, more respectable job roles as a, what was it, the scientific investigator, and then Michelle working in the lab. That's something I noticed as well in this movie. You get that different spectrum of, I guess, class within the Black community.
Right, yeah. And this is actually where earlier I mentioned how they lived in the suburbs, because at this point, Michelle ends up mentioning about how, that man had mentioned about like Tina had been like shaken up from the man that had followed her home. She didn't go to work the next day. And that's when the doctor says, well, we'll move to the suburbs next year. And she says, well, we moved to the suburbs last year. And so that was how I knew, okay, they live in a nicer neighborhood now. And they moved everybody. It wasn't just her and him. It was also Tina. So that's kind of how I made that connection to earlier on in the film, where she had lived.
Oh, yeah. That I get that now. I definitely remember that scene. And while this is going on, Gordon gets a call from Jack saying that he didn't get that permit. He couldn't do it. His hands were tied. So then Gordon kind of goes to Michelle and he's like, well, we got to dig up a grave tonight. I hope you're ready for that. And she's pushing back. She's like, I love you, but this ain't happening. You ain't going to get me in no graveyard. There's no way that's happening. So I thought that was pretty funny that he immediately just like turns to his girlfriend or wife and he's like, well, are you going to come do this with me? And she's like, nope.
Right. And he won her over. He was hitting her with the kisses all on the neck and everything. And that's when she was like, all right.
Yeah, I didn't understand that, but I guess that's what you do for the people you love.
Taking down notes. Keep that in mind, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'll go to the graveyard with you. Yeah.
So then we actually jump back to Tina's apartment where Blacula goes. And he tells her that he couldn't wait to see her, and she lets him in. And he starts to actually tell her the entire story of how he became a vampire, who he is, that he was this prince that was like a slave that was brought over in the slave trade. And Tina's just kind of taking it all in. And she's like, the slave trade? And he's like, yes. And he talks about Count Dracula. He talks about how his wife ultimately died, everything, and that he was brought to her because she is basically the second coming of his wife.
Yeah, and one thing that I kind of stood out to me at this point is she says, oh, that's impossible. I'm not your wife. There's no way. And he immediately says, but you believe it. And she's like, well, I guess I do. So it's definitely, I guess, that wishy-washy from her. She's like, oh, this can't be happening. There's no way. But then I kind of believe this, and I kind of am falling for this guy. What's going on? And after he tells that story, he's like, I want you to come with me. We'll live together forever. And she's like, I don't know. I can't do this. And this guy is such a gentleman, man. Like, he immediately says he won't take her by force, and he's like, I gotta go. If you're not gonna do this with certainty, I'm not gonna even try, because I don't want to have to convince you. You gotta do this on your own free will. I want you to love me for me, not because I'm forcing you to love me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was really surprised by that because, of course, we've seen Blacula kill folks so far in the movie, so it's not like he's really a good guy, but when it comes to the love of his life, he's a total sweetheart when you think about it, which is such a weird transition. But as he's going to leave, that's when Tina just jumps up and says, stay with me, and they begin to make out, and that's where their relationship begins after basically knowing each other for one day.
Yeah, that's just crazy how quickly, I guess, love can advance in movies.
Right? It's like, first scene, you get chased. Second scene, you apologize and explain yourself. Third scene, you say you're a vampire, and then you make out. The end.
If that's all it takes, that's all it takes. Then I gotta learn something from these movies, huh?
And then the next part that we get is the scene cuts to the doctor and his wife or girlfriend, and they're digging up the grave. He gets to the point where he's at the casket, and he opens it up, and that's when Billy pops out, and he's a full-fledged vampire. He attacks him, and the doctor ends up fighting him off, and he takes like a stake that's there and stabs him in the heart, and he then grabs the shovel, I believe, and starts hitting the stake down in him to actually fully kill him. Michelle at this point is completely like screaming. She's saying, he was alive, you killed him, he was alive. And the doctor starts to explain, he was a vampire, I killed a vampire, like he came back to life or whatever. And that's when he finally calms Michelle down, and they start asking and questioning about Bobby, and they both realize that Bobby could ultimately be anywhere at this point.
Yeah, and one thing that really during this scene, Gordon's calming Michelle down because she screamed bloody murder. She thought Billy was alive and he wasn't dead, and he's like, no, I just put him out of his misery. So it gives you that, you know, like why she was yelling, because she believed he was real. She didn't know that vampires had existed yet because he hadn't told her anything. So, and then it jumps to the next scene, and Gordon's calling the morgue, and he asks Sam, that mortician, to take Juanita out of the freezer. He wants her to be fresh and unfrozen, and because he wants to see if Juanita is going to turn into this vampire.
Right, and the morgue man ends up doing that. We see where he's on the has Juanita on the kind of like stretcher bed, and he's walking down the hall, and that's when Juanita comes to life. And again, similar to when Blacula attacked the photographer, she jumps out, and it's like that creepy, like, roar, and like her hair's crazy, her face is crazy, it's kind of green, and she attacks him and kills him.
Yeah, this scene is definitely a little bit terrifying as well. She opens the door, and it's all slow motion, and she's just running all crazy with her hands in the air. Her hair is like frozen, and there's different strands going all over the place. She definitely looks not necessarily like a vampire, just like a crazy person. I don't know if that was really intended for that, but it definitely put some fear into me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we kind of see some of the vampires later on in the film that they have kind of a green tint to their skin. So they kind of look like a mix between a ghoul or zombie and a vampire, which is kind of weird, but it works because it was totally creepy. And what they did with her hair and the way that she acted tremendous in that spot, it was really spot on.
Yeah, for sure. And then after we get this killing of Sam, we cut to Mamuwalde and Tina in bed, and they had just done the business and telling each other that they love each other. But Mamuwalde has to go before the sunlight comes up, and he potentially gets killed. And this is where she says, like, as he's walking away, "I love you," and that's the first time that anyone actually says it. And it goes back to that, oh, you just met him yesterday, and the night before he chased you, now you love him.
It just progresses so much, but it also goes back to Blacula just having that effect. Like we mentioned, he's a smooth talker, and the way that he kind of works in this film is that he knows what he wants, so he kind of tells people what he's going to do or what he wants, and the people just go with it. There's no pushback. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's definitely a different take on, I guess, this new vampire, and it was definitely very interesting to see him get through this modern day after being from, what was it, the 1700s, and him be able to survive in this modern time and just kind of go through everything so smoothly the way he can.
Right, 100%. And so then the next thing that we do get, the doctor and the lieutenant pull up to the morgue area, and they're looking for the man. They're looking for him. His name's Sam, and they don't find him. They don't see Juanita at first when they kind of just pop their head in the morgue room. And so they ended up spotting they spot the blood on the wall. And so, of course, they find out Sam's dead. And so they go back to the morgue area, and there's the area where she was laid down, but more off to the side. And the doctor pulls up the kind of sheet, and that's when she pops out at him too. And because he was reading that book earlier that was on his wife or girlfriend's desk, he realizes like how to kill a vampire. So he has the cross, and then he opens up the blinds, and so when she tries to attack, the son ultimately ends up killing her, and that was the proof for the lieutenant as, hey, this is what's going on. It's vampires.
Yeah, and the lieutenant realizes what's going on as well, and it was definitely an interesting death scene for Juanita, because she was being pushed back against that cross, and then the sunlight comes, but usually when you think of sunlight hitting a vampire, they like melt. She just kind of falls to the ground and stays there, and then we cut to the next scene, and what happens there?
I believe that is where they're all sitting at the venue again, and it is the doctor, it's Michelle, Tina, and Blacula, and they kind of start picking the doctor starts to pick Blacula's brain. He starts to ask him kind of questions like, hey, do you believe in like witchcraft? Do you believe in this? And he starts to kind of say like, oh, well, I believe in, he's like, it's an interesting or it's intriguing or something. And so he starts to ask this question. He brings up vampires, and then he says like, do you believe vampires are real? And he says, well, people believe the devil's real. And he's just being very smart about it. And he's even like kind of smirking as he talks. It was a real like interesting scene.
Yeah, Gordon's trying to pick Mama Waldo apart, kind of insinuating maybe this guy's a vampire. What does he have to say on the topic? And Mama Waldo just works his way through that conversation, going back to that smooth talking. He never hints that he's a vampire. He's just like, vampires could exist, they could not exist. So this character is definitely my favorite character as far as his way getting through this modern day society. So then from there, Skillet joins again, and immediately Mamuwadu seems offended by the presence of Skillet, and he's like, Tina, we have to go. And we get that same saying from Skillet once Mamuwadu and Tina leave, that's a strange dude.
Yep, and this is where my man pulls out the best line of all time. He ends up asking the doctor and Michelle if they've seen that photographer, because he was trying to hit on the photographer from the first scene that she was in, and they were like, no, we haven't seen her. And even Michelle mentions and says, oh yeah, she never brought me back my birthday photos. And and that's when my man ends up saying, Big Skillet, he says, well, when you see her, let her know I got something really groovy for her. I'm telling you, this dude is clean.
He's just as smooth as Mamuwaldi, man.
I'll take Big Skillet. If your name's Big Skillet, you're cooler than Mama Waldy. I don't care if you're a prince.
And another thing I noticed at this point is he was trying to buy off the cape from Mama Waldy. And then it's insinuating that Mama Waldy's kind of getting by with wearing a cape, because this was a time where pimps were very popular and they would wear those big capes and these furs, and he's like, Mama Waldy, let me get that cape off you. So it was definitely pretty funny.
Yep, that was good stuff. And that was unfortunately the last scene that we get with our boy Skillet. But we end up going to where both of them leave and they go back to Tina's place, her and Blacula. And Tina's saying like, why were you giving in to them? Why were you telling them this stuff? And Blacula's kind of like just talking with her, and they ultimately they end up kissing. And she the doctor at this point is on the way to Tina's house, because he realizes that he's the vampire, like it's him. And so he runs into them kissing, and he kind of he tries to smack Blacula, but Blacula smacks him back and then runs away.
Yeah, he knocks him out and gets away, and the police show up and they see Blacula running down the street, so they go after him. And one cop kind of separates himself and he tries to go against Blacula one-on-one, and he ends up getting killed. And then you get all the other people. You get Dr. Gordon, Jack, and this other police officer, and they see this dead policeman. And then it cuts back to the apartment, and Jack and Gordon are talking about Mama Waldo, about what to do, what the next steps are.
Right. And so they're kind of discussing what they're going to need to do to try and find him and kill him, because they do understand at this point that he needs to find a casket. So they say that they need to find where this casket is. Tina comes in, and they inform Tina that Mama Waldy, or Blacula, did end up killing one of the cops, and she's like breaks down because she can't really believe it. And so then the scene, if I'm not mistaken, ends up cutting to some cops in a cop car, and they're looking for Billy, and they spot Bobby on the street. And again, Bobby is one of the gentlemen that were killed in the beginning of the very, very beginning of the film. And one of the cops says, "That looks like him. Is that him?" And the other cop says, "How can you tell? They all look alike," trying to say that all gay people look alike. And they end up following. They like call out, and they say, "Don't get out of your vehicles." Like when you find out like where they're going, you contact us. And they lead them to that big warehouse.
Yeah, this goes back to the warehouse where Blacula was originally transported, and you get all this swarm of cops coming up outside the building, and they start going into the warehouse, and they start searching, and they find a body on the ground, and this is where Bobby emerges, and he's a vampire. You see that, and you get that sense that this is a trap by Mama Waldy. And then two of the side cops that were with Jack and Gordon are attacked, and they end up getting bitten, killed. And then you get Gordon and Jack. They find these lamps and start bombarding these vampires with fire, and you get Bobby bursting into flames. And then one of the cops comes back as a vampire, and Jack is hesitant to kill him because he was, I guess you could say, pretty close with them, or he saw that this policeman was a part of his team, and now he has to kill him, and he couldn't do it. So Gordon grabs the lamp from him, and he sets him ablaze.
Right, yeah, and they all start setting all of the vampires ablaze to try and get out of there and kill as many as possible. I thought this was really funny because do you remember the scene? There was a vampire that jumped from like these super, super high boxes out of nowhere. My man jumped like he was doing a superhuman stunt, yo.
This is for juggalos and juggalettes. Don't try this at home. I hope you like it. Whoop whoop.
Yeah, he was high up on the crates, and he just jumps down onto Gordon, but Gordon's like, "Oh, psych, you missed me," and he falls into this crate and breaks it open.
So yeah, I thought that was hilarious because like, where did this guy come from, man?
The real funny part was after that vampire had missed Gordon, Gordon immediately springs into action. He like swan dives onto that vampire and just like beating him, and he stakes him with a board that he finds lying around. He just goes right into action, and then they leave the warehouse.
Yeah, and so he, right as they're leaving, I know Blacula, he comes up and says that he's moved the coffin, and he turns into a bat and flies away. And he says that he has an appointment. Here, so then it goes to where it jumps where they tell Tina to stay inside of her apartment, to not come down. There's like cops all in the street. There's tons of people in the street. I guess they're trying to, as things are happening, they're trying to avoid, I guess, as much, what would you say, like as much just people out on the street, because they're trying to find out is like where he left this coffin.
Yeah, they send out all these people to do that search, and they really trap Tina in the apartment.
Yeah, and so then there's a lady that screams, and she screams like, "Bat! There's a bat!" And Tina immediately knows what it is, so she actually leaves the apartment. She goes down into the streets, into the huge crowd of people, and basically escapes the area. And she's walking, and she's determined, like she knows exactly where she's going. And there's an alert out for the cops to look for her, and they say don't hurt her, but kill him, basically kill Blacula. And there's some cops that spot her, and they're like, "Is that her?" So they say, drive past, and they drive past her, and she ends up walking into an area called the underground chemical plant number 2. The alert goes on the radio for police, and then all the police bomb rush over there, and at this point she meets Blacula down there, and they kiss, which I originally thought that she was going down there to set up Blacula, but then I quickly learned, no, she was doing this to be with him.
That's interesting that you say that, because I took it as her being in a trance, like the way she was walking to that chemical plant. She just kind of looked straight. She wasn't looking around her. She just kind of knew where she was going, almost like she was being lured. So that's definitely interesting that you had a different take on that.
Yeah, I thought of it as she was gonna kind of not manipulate him, but trick him, essentially, go here, make it appear like she was going to be with him, and then have it where maybe they kiss and she pulls out a stake, or she tries to do something to get away. And I thought maybe Blacula was going to have to use a little bit of force to try at that point, even though he said he would never do it. Maybe he had to pull something out to try and use a little force to get her to coincide with him. That's what I was thinking, but we quickly learned it wasn't. Some cops rushed in there. Blacula's like being very sneaky and stealthy, and a cop rushes down and he kills the cop. And then that's where we get Blacula and Tina making their exit through the power plant, and a cop sees them, aims his gun, and it appears like he aims for quite some time, but instead of shooting Blacula, he shoots Tina.
Yeah, and it goes back to them saying on the radio, "Don't shoot Tina, don't shoot Tina, only Blacula." And the first shot that's taken, Tina dies. And and Blacula kneels down, he's comforting her, and she's like, "Help me, help me." The cop comes over, and he just wreaks havoc on him. He bashes him all the way down. He just keeps pounding on him, and then he goes back to Tina, and he's like, "There's no other choice. We have to get this done." And then I don't remember if it shows on screen if he bites her, but that's kind of insinuated.
Yeah, he like the way that they did the angle is he tells her this is the only way we can be together, because he realizes that she's going to die of the gunshot wound, and so he does bend down and bite her, and it kind of shows, I think, the overhead angle where he's over her neck, and you can see her eyes kind of like get real big, like she's basically dead, and then when he lifts up, you can see the bite marks on her neck.
Yeah, that's right. And then from there, that's where he calls out to everybody in the building, and he really calls out to Gordon in particular. He's like, "You and your friends are dead." And that's where we get this big old chase scene and rampage where Blacula's knocking off these cops one by one. And the killings are pretty funny. Like, he just uses his strength. He doesn't necessarily bite anybody. There's one point where he's high on a ledge and he just starts throwing barrels at this one cop, which was pretty funny. And apparently that cop dies, and then it cuts to another cop meeting up with Gordon, and telling him, "Oh, come here, we found the casket." So then they go to the casket, and Gordon and Jack are preparing themselves to kill whatever is in that coffin.
Yes, and so he has his stake ready, and he's ready to jam it in there. They open up the casket, and we find Tina, who is a vampire. She lifts up. They drop the stake right in her heart. She does her like kind of screaming and a little like wiggling around, and then she ultimately dies. We see her sister Michelle, who's the doctor's girlfriend or wife. She's like running, saying like no, no, because she's still thinking of it as that's my sister, like she's alive. And the doctor has to stop her, and that's when Blacula actually ends up coming up. He appears and he notices Tina's death, and he says his only reason for living has been taken away. And that's when he proceeds he said, because they were ready to essentially, like they were going to try and kill him, and he said there's no need, and he kills himself. He walks right outside into the sun, and he gets burnt to a crisp, and you see his body just like go into maggots basically.
Yeah, that was definitely an interesting scene when referring to Juanita's death earlier in the morgue. Like, she doesn't melt or anything, but then we get Blacula walking out into the sun, and it's very slow. It's a very sad scene. Like, his only reason for living was his love, his Luva, who was his original wife, and now Tina, and that was taken away from him again. So he goes up to the sunlight and he's dying slowly, and then he covers his face with the cape, and then Gordon comes up to see what's happening, and he pulls the cape over, and that's where you get this melting sensation. It's Mamualdo's face, and everything's melted. You get maggots coming through, and then I like the way this movie ends because it just keeps going until it's skull, and that's when the credits start rolling up.
Yeah, that was really nice. And as the credits are rolling, it's you just see his skull in the background.
We at the end of the movie. I definitely like this movie for sure. It's definitely something different, something I haven't seen before. Usually when you get these like these specific names like Blacula, you think this film is going to be a write-off, and it really wasn't. I was definitely surprised with this film.
Yeah, I'll say that the second time around watching it, I enjoyed it more than the first time. And it's not that it was a bad movie at all, because it is actually a really solid movie. I think it's just the second time going in and watching it and trying to look for a lot of those maybe little details and things that you may have missed. It just kind of helped with my enjoyment of the film. And so with that, I know you said you like it. How many pints of blood are you giving it, Jose?
I'm going to give this 6 out of 10 pints of blood. And that goes back to what I was just saying. This was definitely a surprising film. I had never seen it before. And it was a lot more serious than what I thought it was going to be. Definitely the racial injustices throughout this movie were what stood out to me the most. But there were, I guess, those dated, prejudices against the gay couple and certain black people throughout this movie that just didn't sit right with me. So it's definitely a fun watch, something I would definitely recommend for all our listeners to definitely check out, but it does kind of get dated as the years go by. What about you?
I'll give it, I think I'll have to give it 6.5. I got to give it a little bit higher than you did. My reasoning behind it is because some of those things that didn't sit right with you, I think that, not that I necessarily enjoyed that, because I didn't, but I felt that it was important to be placed in this film, because while that was normal during this time, it allows for us nearly 50 years later to go back and watch that movie and recognize how far we've come in certain areas and kind of what we can learn from it. And I think that's why I enjoyed that was included in that movie. Now, I think the reason I don't give it anything higher, because it was a good movie, is I don't think it has as much rewatchability as, let's say, last week with Candyman. I don't see myself wanting to watch this movie anytime soon. It's something that I may go back and watch, years and years down the road, or again, if someone I know is interested in watching it, but that's about it.
Yeah, I definitely agree that rewatchability factor isn't present in this movie. So you can definitely just watch this once and kind of wait a while to give it another chance. But I know you did mention earlier the second time that you've watched this, you did like it more. So I guess watch it a few times, get your own feelings about it, and it'll definitely be interesting. The more you watch it, the more you pick up on these little things that even me and Deonte missed throughout this movie. When we were talking about it, there were certain things that we missed. So it's definitely a good watch the once, and I do agree with the fact of those certain things that I didn't like being included in this movie. I agree with that because it's something we can learn off of. It's something that shows how the times have changed, the progress that we've made, but because those are still there, it just makes it that much harder to watch.
Right. Completely understandable. Well, with that, before we do wrap this up and get on out of here, did you have any type of fun facts that you wanted to throw in?
Yeah, I wanted to point out that during the production stages of this movie, William Marshall, who plays Prince Mamuwalde or Blacula, he worked with the producers to kind of give the character that he was playing a sense of dignity. And we do get that throughout this film, and it was mainly because of him. He wanted Mamuwalde to be a prince and to have this slavery background. The original name for that character was going to be Andrew Brown, and I don't think I would have liked this movie as much if we had taken the prince background, the African background, away from Blacula and having him go and confront Dracula about the slave trade.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and then another one that I have here is when this movie was being put into theaters, the marketing department, they wanted to bring in that black audience to come and see their movie. So a lot of the posters reference slavery, even though we get that at the beginning of the movie, very briefly. And then in New York, another promotion that theaters were doing is if anyone was wearing a cape, they would get in for free. So they really just tried to bring in that audience, bring in those people and fill those seats.
What? That's crazy.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting marketing tactic, especially knowing that box office and the profit that they made. If they let so many people watch this movie for free, I guess they were coming back to rewatch it and, give it the support that it needed. And another thing here that I have is the original trailer for this movie portrayed Blacula as a kind of black avenger, and most of the scenes that were put in this trailer were of him attacking the police, and that's where you get that black avenger. Is they tried to bring in that black audience by making it more relatable to what they were going through that time, with racism and the police and all those things. And that just to bring in that audience, they really went through drastic measures instead of portraying this film for what it really was.
Wow, that would have been really interesting. I don't think that if that version of this film came out, it would not have been as, I guess, like prevalent as, not that Blacula is huge or anything, but I just don't think that would have really popped, especially during that time. I think it would have been very much so just getting the black audience and then alienating kind of everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely, like I said, it's definitely a good movie to watch because you do get these racial injustices throughout the movie, and it's something that's still going on today, with the police versus the black people, and that this movement that we're going through, it's definitely prevalent.
Right, exactly. And did you have any other cool facts for us, Senor?
That is actually all I could find on this movie. This movie didn't really have much to go along with it. Of course, I haven't spent $80 on a physical copy, so I couldn't get my hands on the interviews and such, and I'm sure there's a lot more to be researched on this, but from what I could find with my own research, it's a lot of hidden things with this.
Right, yeah, and hopefully at some point we do get a reprint of that movie, whether it's through Scream Factory or if someone else gets the rights. That way we can purchase it, look into all of it and all that good stuff. But with that, we'll go ahead and end this here. Once again, you can follow us on social media on Instagram at Gruesome Task Podcast, on Twitter at The Gruesome Task, myself on Instagram at xdeontems, and on Twitter at _underthe knife.
You can find me on Twitter at thatguyjose and on Instagram at j.a.gallegos. Before I give my sign off, I just want to once stress how important this Black Lives Matter movement is in our society today, and to definitely go check out our social medias about any information if you're interested at all in helping us donate to the Black community. This is definitely important to us, and it should definitely be important to you because we do need this change. And we are definitely excited to continue this and go through these Black and Horror series, because it needs to be more known how good these movies can be. Like, even us, we thought this movie was going to be a write-off, but it was a lot better than we expected, because we expect these Black movies to be more comedy and less important, but we're excited to show you and introduce you to more great films.
I couldn't have said it better myself, sir. For that, we have the links in our Twitter, as well as you can find them on Instagram and Facebook as well. At Horror Pack, you can use code ITFOLLOWS, and that will save you $3 on your monthly pack. And again, like Jose mentioned, we are donating any proceeds that we do get from that program to various Black organizations. Now, with that, I want to thank everybody for listening in on this episode, and I want to thank everyone for all the support that we've received thus far. How many pints of blood are you drinking?
Life sucks, and then you die.